Okay, everybody, we're just at the start of the official time, but I think we're going to allow a few more minutes for more people to join, and then we'll get started with the with today's interim. Jonathan, can you hear me? Okay, I think we've got enough of the presenters in the room now that we can probably get started, since we want to dispense with the chair stuff and get to the meat today. So welcome everybody to another MIMI interim working group session. So as usual, this meeting is subject to all of the IETF's policies on intellectual property and being nice to each other. So please note well the note well. And before we move on, we do need a note taker for today's session. So if anybody, would somebody please volunteer to take notes? So we can't proceed unless we have somebody taking notes on the session. So we would very much appreciate a volunteer. All right, thanks. So for the record, Ecker has grudgingly agreed to take some notes. Thank you very much, appreciated. All right, let's talk now about today's agenda and Bash. So today we're talking about user discovery. We're going to start by having a few different presentations on requirements, so that because we need the working group to agree on like what are the requirements we're solving for before we get into specific solution proposals. So we'll be hearing in order from Jonathan, then Ecker, who will somehow take notes on himself, Giles, and then Vittorio. And then time allowing, we'll look into some of the proposals for solutions though we do need to agree on what the requirements are before we do that. So are there any objections or suggestions with respect to the agenda? Okay. One last program note is that the data tracker apparently is undergoing a large bot attack today, which means it might be unusually unreliable in terms of showing like the slides that people have submitted. So we're going to do our best, but if you're presenting and you find that the wrong slides have appeared, please just let me know, and I hopefully have like locally a copy of the correct slides, and then I'll just screen share to present them. Okay. So with that, let's move on to, I think, Jonathan. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And see me too? Yes, no?
Yes.
All right, outstanding.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find your slides.
I mailed them out like an hour ago.
Yep. I put them in the data tracker, but nope. Here we go. Okay, good. All right, just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Next slide. Yeah, next slide. All right. So I wrote a draft on requirements to try and get us aligned on the problem we're trying to solve. The most important thing is probably this picture, which I'm not sure we're actually this in the next slide. We're all even on the same page here. So let me. You can't build a protocol if you don't even agree the system architecture in which it lives. So in the framework here, the idea is that we have users. These are users of messaging services. Those are the app providers. So app provider 1, maybe it's WhatsApp. App provider 2, maybe it's Facebook Messenger. At least according to the EU, it's not going to be iMessage unless something's changed. But it's some app here that is a consumer or an enterprise application. We'll talk more about those use cases in a moment. And those providers connect to discovery providers. It could be that an app provider is also a discovery provider, but we are building protocols here. So we will support the case where it is not. And so the app provider talks to the discovery provider when they want to do a mapping or a discovery request. And specifically, that's like, okay, one of my users wants to talk to someone or chat with someone that's got this phone number or email address. So the app provider would ask the discovery provider, please map this email or phone number, which is a service independent identifier, to a service specific identifier. So the result will come back with a user ID and a provider name or ID of some sort. That's the framework for what we're trying to talk about. In this picture, therefore, there are 2 protocols in question. There is a protocol between the app provider and the discovery provider, and one between discovery providers. So I'm going to pause there and see, like, do people agree this is the problem we're solving?
Jonathan, do you want to run the queue?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Do you want Tim and I to run the queue, or do you want to run the queue yourself?
Oh no, I wasn't going to run the queue. I didn't even know it needed to be run. It looks like Eric goes next, so Ecker.
Honestly, I had no idea. It might be, depends on what other things we want to think about are. But I can imagine being no discovery providers at all. I can imagine there being only one. So I have no idea. I agree with the bottom half of their user connecting app providers. That part I agree with.
All right. So you think that the main thing you're not sure about is whether there's 1 or 2 discovery providers, or that they are separate from the
I'm not sure. Maybe they're none. I mean, I have like sort of a, not actually a straw man, more like an intuition pump on one of my slides, but it's like, imagine a world in which basically there's a global directory that everyone just downloads and just keeps synchronized. It's not really that big. Like, what's wrong with that? Like, I mean, I don't think it's really a good solution, but I'm just saying, like,
well, I think in that model, we're saying that there is one discovery provider, and you're suggesting the protocol between the app provider and discovery provider is not query, but download. Yeah.
Well, no, I'm saying maybe the users download it.
Oh, users download it.
I don't
Oh,
know.
okay.
Like, I mean, I'm just saying, like this is like an answer to a question. I don't know what the question is yet. And so, so I think like we got to start with the question, not the answer.
Well, okay, but I thought the question I think we're starting for is how to solve the following user experience problem,
No.
which is I'm on WhatsApp and you're on Facebook Messenger, and I want to type in, and all I got is your mobile number, and I want to be able to allow
Sure.
my MIMI provider to connect to your MIMI provider. That's
Sure,
the
but I
problem.
think, but I mean, what I described would do that, right? There's like a global directory that was a global directory every day, and like it's just local, right?
Right.
I mean, like
All
you know,
right.
I mean, I don't. I'm just saying it's a great solution. I'm just saying we have to like have requirements, and I'm not there yet.
Okay, well, we're not going to get very far, like, unless we. That's why I'm glad I brought this picture up, because if we don't think we should bother doing this, like, you have to at least assume this picture to do any protocol work. So
No, you have to assume some picture. You have to do some pictures of protocol work.
yeah, I'm proposing this one. So
I know, but I'm saying that this one, whether this one is a good one or not, derives from other requirements that we have not yet established.
Okay, all right. It'd be great if you can elaborate on those, but I think we should give others a chance to weigh
Yeah,
in.
why don't we let people talk?
Ryan?
Hi. So whether or not this is the right discovery problem, the right multi-provider discovery problem to solve, like, I'm not particularly interested in this problem, and I would be perfectly happy if we defer working on this for, you know, another year until we make more progress on other protocols. So
Yeah, understood.
that's just my, you know, that's just one view, and I will shut up for the rest of this presentation.
So and the good news is I did know that, Rowan. I do have some of the other slides I'll go into give a little bit more use cases that motivate why, what reasons why one might care more about this problem. So we'll go through them, but I understand that it's not high on your priority list. Thank you. Charles?
Yeah, I broadly agree that those are the actors in this system. They don't necessarily connect in the way that those lines suggest that they connect. But
Well, so
yeah,
what's the
I mean,
difference in your model? In your view?
Well, like the previous person said, the user could connect directly to a discovery provider potentially. I mean,
Okay.
I don't think that's how it should work, but and I kind of agree with the model, but in terms of requirements, we should start with just the main the user journey. I think we should start with the user journey, which is like you said, I have a phone number, or it doesn't have to be a phone number, by the way. It can be any kind of arbitrary identifier, and I want to discover the delivery point and the delivery service and the key distribution service for a specific provider who has that, who can deliver a message to that user. So I guess I'm saying that let's not spend too long on this diagram. I think the user journey is more important.
Well, I think the reason I keep coming back, the reason I put this picture first is we're like in. I'm getting a lot of echo. Maybe you could mute. Maybe you can turn off your audio. Turn off your audio. Thanks. All right. The reason I put this picture first is like you can't build protocols without a reference architecture. We here at IETF build protocols. We need a reference architecture. The reference architecture changes dramatically the protocols. If you think users talk directly to the discovery services, this is a different system, in my opinion, because it has dramatically different trust and authentication and other models, and like at least I would argue download the entire global user directory. Probably not a good idea, Ecker, honestly, in the user case. not out of the question in the app provider case. So it certainly changes the privacy, data location, other things. So like, I think we have to agree on a picture or we're not going to make much progress on debating protocols. Let me address one of the things you suggested. Well, that you said, okay, there's a different formulation in which the users talk directly to the discovery service. And Edgar mentioned this, you mentioned this. And I thought about it a bunch too. I will say I ruled it out in my brain. And let me explain why at least I came to that conclusion, is I found it quite impractical. And the reason I say that is, even ignoring the, like, I'm going to download the whole database, which again, I think is not going to happen, but like, hey, what about like a user just queries this thing with a phone number or an email address, and it gets the result back? Like, can't we do that? And at least I didn't think that was likely because it requires a, like, I have to have a new entity. Like, I'm going to have that me as a user and my application software have a business relationship with. So if I'm a user of WhatsApp, now I somehow need to sign up for an account with or use some other third-party discovery provider service that helps me find other people. And I just think that that's like not likely to work, right? It was a very impractical solution. So I was trying to focus on adoptability for the solution here. And yeah, just let me finish before you unmute. Because we're getting a little yeah. I'm just about done. So because I thought of the impracticality of introducing another actor that a consumer or enterprise user have to build a relationship with is not only troublesome, it also is a critical mass issue, right? I mean, so like you need every user who has a messaging app to now sign up and have an account with this global service. That seemed unlikely to me. Now I'll stop. You can respond to that if you like, Joseph.
I think whether the solution is impractical or not, we should focus on this session is about the requirements. And I think you're kind of bleeding into the, how do we solve for the requirements there? Like the requirements don't tell you how it should be architected. They just tell you what needs to be done. And that can be done in a number of practical or impractical ways. And so I think we shouldn't fall into the classic trap of mixing and requirements up with solutions. I'll stop.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll give others a chance to comment then. Go ahead, Vittorio.
Yes. Yes. Well, this also looks to me more like a solution, the architectural solution, than a definition of the problem. So I think we should start by defining the problem, which in my mind is so to convert whatever identifier the user has, and which is a human-friendly identifier, into the information necessary to establish the connection and go on. And so, I mean, I think that, I mean, for example, this already has the assumption that you have one or more discovery providers, but maybe it's because I come from the email world. In the email world, there's discovery, but there's no discovery provider. There's just one DNS query, which is sort of what I tried to, I mean, imagine in my draft. So, but before even getting to that, I think we should, I mean, start by defining the problem, going through the use cases and see what are the requirements to solve them. And then maybe we will naturally get into this kind of architecture, but maybe we also come up with something completely different.
Okay. Becker?
I think I like largely agree with what Victoria just said. I think there are a bunch of implicit requirements in this architecture that get you here, and I think the biggest one is the one embodied on your slides aren't numbered, but I believe it's slide I believe it's slide 15, your last slide, which is that you seem to think that it is bad to have the mapping database be public, and in Giles' presentation in San Francisco, he implicitly assumed the mapping database is public. And I think enormous amount of the requirements here are derived from that basic disagreement about what the situation might be. And so I think that is not a question about does not require knowing this architecture. It requires the question of, is the mapping database public? So I would suggest that we talk about what are the things that drive that drive the kind of architectural choices you think you want to make. And I think that's really one of them. I think another one is who should be allowed to assert identities,
Yep.
and I think under what if any, administrative control of those restrictions be, which I think is what you kind of get at with your geographic restrictions. So I think perhaps those would be the things we ought to debate. I exercise in this, but you see exercise in this too. So I think, I guess I would like to try to move there. I think because I think we can discuss all those things without discussing any architectural questions first.
Okay.
And I think.
Got it. I think I think this is fair comment. It's clear the read of the room is, and I think this is an accurate assessment that there are, if you look at my requirements doc and the slides, there are a subset of them that are fairly independent of the architecture picture, and there are those that are specific. So let's debate the ones that are independent of it, and then see what we think it means for the picture. I think that's fair. So after Rowan, I suggest we close the mic, and I'll focus on those of the requirements. Rowan?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, since we were talking about the public option, like Keybase wasn't, particularly successful, but it was successful enough to get bought by Zoom, and that was a less stupid than just download a file public directory, basically, for something like this. So just as a example.
Okay, got it. All right, so why don't we stop the mic queue? We got no more left, and I suggest we skip the next slide because it's still in the architecture picture. Yeah, go to the next one. So let's talk about the cardinality requirements, because I think that at least for the app providers, I'm making a statement here, and this is where I'll go through some slides and then I'll pause again for comments, that there could be a lot of them, and I say thousands, and we may not trust them. So let's go through that if those are requirements. Next slide. So let's talk about the cardinality of the app providers and how many we're trying to solve for. So I tried to sort of break these down into different types of use cases, and in particular, make sure we're thinking about ones that are maybe not the top of mind one. The top of mind one is like the first category, which is consumer over the top applications. I think this is one we all pretty much want to understand well. It's like WhatsApp and Wire and Facebook Message. I also put iMessage in this category. I'll come back to why I said in just a second. So this is sort of the over the top, not affiliated with an operator of a telephone service or an email service. And so that's this first category. If you just cared about this category, there isn't a lot of these providers today. We have the gatekeepers plus other vendors like Wire who are in the market. I don't know, maybe it's dozens or so. The next category is a really interesting one, which I was calling consumer operator aligned. And what I mean by this is, and the only one I think in this category is Google Messages. And I say that because this is one where it's this service is provided by your mobile operator in this case. Your identifier in the service is your mobile number. You become a customer of this because it's on your phone in the mobile case when you get your phone from that provider, or you sign up for them, and it can't be decoupled. So this is sort of Google Messages. You might argue that, hang on, why are you even talking about this category? Because this whole effort is focused on non-number aligned services, but this is one where it's not using the SMS network, it's RCS in the case of Google. Sometimes it's run by the operator, sometimes it's run by Google, and we want to connect it. So that's why I listed. To me, one of the use cases, I think is really interesting, and I hope we can solve, is the quote unquote green bubble problem, which is Android to iMessage interoperability. And can we get to the point where, I don't have these big differences in the user experience, and that requires us to solve the interconnection for those. The reason I think it ends up being a separate category is it introduces some additional interesting use cases around like transitions between numbers and porting, and I'll talk more about that. The third category is enterprise cloud. So we mostly talk about consumer, but enterprise, again, from a system, I think is in scope. Again, that's a debate we're going to have in a moment, that we're not ruling it out. We allow it to happen. And so here too, you can say there's enterprise cloud providers. These are people who provide messaging, voice and video communication services, one-to-one and one-to-many, focused on enterprise users. This enterprise cloud are cloud providers. And so this is folks like RingCentral, Zoom, WebEx, my own company Five9, which does Cloud Contact Center. This is another variation on the enterprise use case. We send and receive messages, and we would like to be able to do that by interconnecting with these other consumer providers or other enterprises. The last two I include largely for completion. I don't think these are significant use cases, but there's an on-prem enterprise, maybe, Bank of America. I don't even know if this is still true, but back in the heyday, people used to run their own call manager or Jabber on-prem. And so they might actually request federation. Like I can see a world in which a large enterprise supports messaging, voice, video, one-to-one, and group, and they go and request interop with a gatekeeper where they want to join the network to allow their employees to message to other businesses or consumers who are connected to this global network that effectively we're looking to build here with Mimi. The last category is, the on-prem consumer case, where again, I'm like I got a Linux box at home and I'm running my own open source version of something that provides messaging services to my family. It looks a lot like the enterprise on-prem, except the probability that I can request interop, like I'm never going to be able to get on the attention of someone to explicitly request interop, but besides that, like that's the category. So that's a categorization I thought about. And if you consider this list, you start to have a lot more vendors, especially if you think about the enterprise on-prem case. I don't think there's going to be a ton of them, but there will be some. And it only takes 20 or 30 large enterprises, and you've jumped the cardinality significantly. So I'll pause there. I think it's a good stopping point. Do folks agree or disagree that this is a set of use cases that we are trying to support for the discovery problem? Ecker, you're up.
Yeah, me again. I think this is a pretty good taxonomy. I might quibble with some of the details, but I think it's a pretty good taxonomy. I think there's a really important point that you made that sort of got hidden between by me urging, probably by me urging you to skip ahead, which is that you sort of say you think these are untrusted, and so I think that is like that gets more becomes more of a requirement the deeper you get into the stack. Like it's not really plausible to have a Linux box on my own that there's any trust relationship. And I think that that's going to become relevant like really soon in terms of again this the public publicity database, right? Or essentially anything that requires correct behavior on the part of the application providers. Is basically a non-starter as soon as you get below enterprise cloud space, or even enterprise cloud maybe, right? And in particular, I think just to push on this a tiny bit, if you imagine a system with some Oracle that contains the database, and and it tries to rate limit the rate at which you can, and the way it tries to conceal the database is by rate limiting how many queries you can make, which is basically the only thing it can possibly do. If you allow anybody to join the system, then that's game over, right? Because I'll just spin up 1,000 guys and all query for 1,000th database, and this database is closed and it's done, right? So I think it's quite small. It's actually quite small. So I think either that actually tells us that we either have to give up on one. We already have to give up on something, right? Either give up on allowing random people to own the system, or have to give up on privacy database.
Yeah. So, and I think even if you, thanks for that. And I agree, like part of the reason I didn't, again, talk to the sort of trustability, but I do think it's a fault. It pops out of the categorization here. But it even shows up in the top one. Like, I think about it like, okay, so if I'm, my job is in the business of spending spam emails, I'm going to look at this thing and say, oh man, this thing is like winning the lottery. Like I'm going to start what looks like a consumer messaging app, and it might even have real users. But its objective is to generate lots of spam traffic and sell it. I mean, people do this. So
yeah,
I think this is.
I certainly agree it's a threat, but I guess I do want to resist it a little bit. The assumption you seem implicitly making, which is that threat should be fixed by considering the mapping table, as opposed to making the system other way. I mean, we have a worked example of like a system that has effectively a public mapping table, and where spam suppression happens. And I know people try to conceal their email addresses, but it doesn't really work. And if you do, you should get plenty of spam. If you send enough email, you get plenty of spam, right? And so I agree with you, it's all spam, but I want to resist a little bit the notion that has to be concealed, has to be fixed by by concealing the identifier space. That's not an obvious conclusion to me.
Okay, so just to make sure, let me repeat what I think you said. I'm not sure I got all that. I think what you're saying is you agree with the premise that there'll be untrustable providers, but that doesn't mean the database has to be private and blocked from being accessible by those bad actors. Is
Right.
that
I mean, like, as a practical matter, like, well, yeah, it's a practical matter in email, right? Everybody, like, not everybody's email is public. People's emails are generally pretty public, and people try to conceal their email. It doesn't work very well. And and so spam suppression is based on content analysis. It's based on sender reputation, all those things. And so I'm just saying, like, it's not obvious to me that the place to fix spam is to make the identifier secret. It may be, but it's like that's an obvious conclusion.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Any other comments, at least on this?
Yeah, there's Q. So I have a question, and it's actually kind of applies to all of MIMI, not just to discovery, something you and I have talked about before, which is that if we assume that, some of what's driving this are the DMA requirements, and also just that, like, those who have the obligation to interoperate are going to have some measures in place to mitigate interoperating with other providers that they themselves don't trust, who they think are the spammy providers.
Yes.
Like, I think that bears on these last two categories. Like, if the last two categories really, like, blow open the number of potential interoperating parties, then that makes it much more difficult to negotiate on a bilateral basis exactly which other providers I'm willing to interop with as a standalone or a gatekeeper provider. So I think I just want to raise that because, like, of course, like, conceptually, like, we want to support all of these. Like, it would be great to have as much interop as possible. But I think, like, realistically, my expectation is that it's more likely that this is driven towards, like, a limited set of entities that are willing to federate with each other. And so that bears on this discovery question, but it bears on other things as well. And if other people agree with that, then that's meaningful for, whether we truly consider those bottom two categories as, like, first order use cases or not.
Yeah, so I think there's two things that I would separate here. One is, like, the cardinality question, and then the second is the trustability question, and whether or not the trustability problem is just sort of implicitly solved by the fact that, no one's going to let you just join this thing. You're going to have to request to federate with these gatekeepers. So on the first one, like, I think even if you don't go to the bottom two, the cardinality is still pretty big. The bottom one we should just eliminate. I mean, it's not like, Joe Tinker is not going to go to WhatsApp and request interop anyway. But enterprise on-prem, I think, is a good chance. That a large enterprise may say, hey, I generate enough message traffic. I look at my bill, like the amount of money I'm spending on delivering SMS to users that actually have WhatsApp or iMessage, that I could reduce my cost, and my business users have a need for communicating with consumers in B2C use cases, and they need the feature set that comes from getting out of SMS, like, it's worth it for me. And so I can see a lot of that. And I can promise you it's definitely worth it from an enterprise cloud. That's why I'm in this meeting. I mean, for multiple reasons, but that's one of them. Like, I am very interested. Like, I would go and request interop. Like, this is useful to us as a business. So I think it's going to happen. And that means the cardinality is higher. Whether they're all trustable or not, my view on this is, like, I like the idea of defense in depth, meaning, like, there's multiple, I don't want to go with a model that says we assume they're trusted because no one is going to federate with them unless they were trusted in the first place. I like that there's a check on the federation, that we're not going to get terrible people in here, but I would love it if our protocols also dealt with people whose behavior is not great. And that's why I continue to focus a lot on the untrusted case. And I think it shows up in the consumer OTT case. Again, I think you'll have cases where there's a lot of businesses that sit on the fuzzy line of whether they're legit versus not. That are hard to know, and I think the more we can protect against that, I think the better. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's fair. But just to come back, you sort of drew a line on consumer on-prem, and
Yeah.
you're fine if the requirements don't support those scenarios, and it would be good to hear from other people if they.
That's my view. Yeah, that we should support the top 4 of these. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Josie, next.
I don't think bilateral agreements or federated multi-party agreements are the only way to ensure that you have trusted actors in the federation. You can also use, certification programs or something like that to set a minimum bar of trustworthiness. And then also you could have, if you wanted to include the last 2, you could have sort of 2 disjoint federations where the trust is established differently.
Okay.
That's all.
I don't quite follow that one. What do you mean some other federations where the trust is established differently? Can you elaborate?
For the consumer OTT, for the
Well, let's ignore the consumer on-prem. That's just not going to happen. So just let's focus on
for the first 2, consumer OTT and consumer operator align, you could have 50 bilateral agreements or whatever as a way of establishing trust, and you could have them as an island playing together. And then for enterprise or consumer on-prem, you could have a certification requirement that requires an audit or something, and have that as a completely separate island of interoperability.
Okay. For what's worth, I do hope we can get away with, like, the goal in my mind of the MIMI effort is to not require bilateral. Although if the only thing that mattered was bilateral, you can argue we don't even need to be here as a working group, right? I think the idea I'm hoping is that it's more of a, some kind of group federation. Whether there's multiple, I guess, but all right, fair enough. I want to make sure we get to everyone in the queue. Vittorio.
Yes, well, I understand. I think it makes sense to consider who would be the early adopters, so to make sure that it makes sense for them. But at the same time, I don't think we should preempt the business models and the types of deployment that will be possible. So we should design this in the most flexible way that we can imagine, so that even future, different way of putting MIMI into something can be supported. And so this implies supporting any number of and any type of services that want to interface and interoperate. And actually, if you think of like Matrix today, there are people that self-host their Matrix installation and will want to be part of this new federation. So even the last part, the last item on the list, I don't think you can just rule it out. Actually, I don't think we should build this thing for like a centralized world in which you only have a limited number of operators. So, and once you start to assume that you can have any number of services that want to interoperate, then it's really any number. So you do like an email. As I said, I'm taking this by analogy for email. And in email, you deal with the trustability problem with at the higher level with reputation, with another number of things, but not by building a protocol that basically excludes some possible types of email service.
Okay, thank you, Ecker.
I largely got up to say what Vittorio just said, which is I think we should design a system which actually, in principle, could work for like all these cases. And it's like not like I think we have to be aware that the DMA proposal is not like the world's greatest interoperability proposal. It's just like it's a make work. And they'd be better if we didn't rely on that. So I think while I think I'm happy to have something. If we don't know how to solve their own problem, I guess like that's like something we can do. But like I prefer to design something that didn't exclude the solution for the general problem if we could. I think one more thing I'd like to mention here, and this is going to become like really relevant when we start talking about identity. Is we've been talking a lot about the privacy of the database, right? But one question is where do identities come from? And impersonation is much worse than database revelation. And so even if I was willing to trust Joe Tinker with a copy of the database, I probably would not be willing to allow him to assert any phone number that he wished to assert. So we're clearly going to design it that does not require. I don't think it requires trusting almost. I mean, certainly doesn't require trusting anybody below like consumer operator line, and maybe not even below, and an ideal world, not even people above it, right?
Yeah, I agree. That's a good lead into the last slide I'll probably get to. So if we could go to advance the next slide, and I think we'll end here. So this is, to me, the most important core requirements. They're not specific to the architecture. One is we have to, it must support, like, functionally work, provide a mapping, whether it's by a lookup or a download or whatever. I think this one's probably super non-contentious. Ecker's sort of talking about the next one, which is the hard problem, right? Which is, how do you make sure the mappings in question are valid and trustable? And to me, that is the bulk of the problem. And it becomes super hard if you convince yourself that we don't necessarily trust, even if you think the provider is, a respectable organization, like, do you trust their assertions on which phone numbers and email addresses correspond to the users in their system? Like, just from maybe they messed it up, or what if they're wrong? Like, I mean, these all come up, and the system has really bad properties if incorrect data gets into the system. So valid and trustable is a key property to deliver, and I think it's really, really hard. The third one is sort of scars that I have and others who are in this session that have been doing this for a long time. This is not the first time we've been in working group meetings that have tried to solve how do we have a way to look up things that aren't hierarchical and map them to some service, right? This has been tried multiple times. Enum being the one of the ones I'll call out as a particularly substantive IETF effort that largely didn't work. It got some deployment. I don't know if we have John Peterson on the meeting here, but he reminded me that this got rolled out in private environments, but the public deployment of Enum, where there's a public global database, never manifested itself. And one of the reasons this is super hard is this network effect problem. So if you need to create a new database that has mappings in it, you have a network effect problem, which is like, well, the very first user that wants to consume this database gets no value out of it. There's no entries in it. You can't do anything with it. And so their incentive to contribute mappings, for example, is also low, because like, they're not going to get any value. Other people aren't going to get any value until this thing has a lot of data in it. It actually isn't useful. And you can't underestimate the challenges with this network effect cold start problem. And so I don't want to do another repeat where like, oh, I know, let's like invent a new, central database and everyone consumer apps directly write this data into, I have an app on my phone that uploads my data. Isn't that great? Like, it's not going to work. Like we've tried this kind of thing like many times. Enum, Viper, these are all attempts at this, and they didn't work. So I think something that doesn't explicitly acknowledge this and try and solve it is pretty important. And the last one is, again, related to this, which is like, what's the incentive to populate these mappings, right? And one answer is it's obligated by regulatory agency. Maybe there's other rationales for it, but again, I think you have to really understand that as part of the solution. So there's only 2 minutes left before the next agenda item, so I think I'll stop here and see if there's any comments on this. Wow. Surely someone disagrees with something on the slide. So you can't go to an IETF meeting where everyone agrees with everything on the slide. All right, there we go. Alyssa.
Well, I mean, maybe just to reflect a little bit from the chat and get people into the queue. I mean, I think people assume number 3 and 4 will be taken care of in this case, not in the naive way, but in the you have providers who are it's not the tail wagging the dog, right? It's like none of this is going to work at all, and they have to make it work, and therefore things will be populated with mappings, right? So so maybe that's part of why people are quiet. And then the top 2 are functionally these are the only things that matter, right? Like it has to work and it has to be trusted. So I don't know. I feel like feel like yes, I like agreed, but some of these are the basis for the very discussion that we're having. So
yeah, but I do think that number 3 and 4 manifest. I agree. In the end, it's not, basically it's going to come down to a gatekeeper is obligated to put their database in this thing. There's almost no other thing that works. However, I do think the way in which that manifests is relevant. Like, I can answer that says, I know we're gonna have WhatsApp. Like, our solution is that WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger have to like take their list of phone numbers and email addresses and like publish them on a public site. Like, at least to me, that everyone downloads onto their device. I think the odds that someone like, I don't think they're going to agree to such. I think they would make arguments that that's not a good thing. So protecting data, figure out a way that this minimizes the exposure of what would normally be considered business sensitive data to the people who own this data, I think becomes a requirement because of this thing. Ecker?
Yeah. So, you're really shocked to hear this, but it used to be the case that you could just buy like a book that had like everybody's phone number in it. And you could just like buy that book, and it was like just page through it and had a name, like it's an index, right?
They didn't drop it at your door though. Like they didn't like.
Well, I mean, it depended. Right? It was like dead trees, but but there was a book. So I guess I'm less persuaded by this privacy point, but I think stepping back for a second, I do think that like. I do think we could bungle design so badly that like no one would want to use it. But I think basically like I'm less concerned about this question of like will people be willing to populate the database because like everybody who's a big player is either going to like do it or not because they were forced to. I mean they would have done it already if they wanted to, and they only do it now because they were forced to. And so like I think it just has to be better. It just has to be better than like the alternative. Yeah. Which like and whether it's database centralized or federated, the mechanism, whatever it is, people are going to publish into this because they're made to, right? And so I think it has to not stink, and I think it has to be the other requirements that like we've laid out here. But I think if we made those requirements, I think people will again not do it because it's like in the technologically goofy.
Yeah, but this is what's interesting is in my mind, if you acknowledge that there are providers who have numbers that are not WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger who are obligated to do this by the DMA, but they have users and that data has to be populated in some way. That's to me where some of the hard parts of the problem is like, how do we trust that? Do we have to trust everybody equally in this system so that like if you join, we trust whatever numbers you tell us? That's one where I'm
no. I agree. I think that won't work, right? Right. I think as Richard Burns, who just got out of the queue, would say, trust is a bad word. I certainly think a design that does not require you to trust the identity assertions provided by providers is imperative, basically. At least for smaller providers and probably for larger ones, and eventually for I mean, like just to talk about philosophy for a second, like. We're trying to like retrospectively design a system that is a system we actually wanted on the backs of these systems that already exist, and having to make a bunch of compromise because the systems that already exist, which is a point you made a number of times, right? And so, like, I think retrospectively, if we have to like accept that like WhatsApp doesn't lie, but the phone numbers for a while, like that's probably like not the best situation, but okay. And that, but that like 5 nines has to prove they're not lying. I mean, that would be like an okay solution, at least for me, maybe not for you.
I think that's what we need. Like that's what my proposed solution basically had that bifurcation. It said we're gonna minimize the trusted set to the fewest number of providers that we trust the most, and everyone else has to be. We're gonna verify their numbers because we don't believe them. Like that's. I
think we're largely on the same page there.
Okay. All right. I think we got time for one more before we switch to you, and I'll take notes while you're speaking, Ecker, so you don't have to. Last comment.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, as I said in chat, every major messaging provider today already makes their database public, and the only protection on it is rate limiting. So I can look up a key. I can look up a key on WhatsApp or your identity key on WhatsApp or Google Messages. It's completely public, and the only protection is rate limiting. So we wouldn't be changing.
But you can't
the
enumerate
status
it. As a
quo.
consumer, you cannot enumerate it.
I don't understand that point. Sorry. And what
So
do you mean by
if I sign
enumerate?
up for WhatsApp, it's definitely true. I can put in a phone number and I can see whether it's another user on WhatsApp. Like that's a required feature of the product. But what I can't
Yeah.
do is download a database of all whatever 500 million users and find out the
Oh
set
yeah,
of
but that's not. I don't think that should be a requirement here. The requirement is
agree.
I need to be able to look up. I need to be able to look up as a client. I need to be able to look up the keys for a given phone number, and obviously I can brute force the database by doing that, but I don't need to be able to like.
You can't if we have rate limiting. That's why we're getting into solutions.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But for me, I guess for me, there's a requirement here, and it's more a security requirement, and then ECR is going to cover that, so I'll go into it. But like, I am opposed to solutions with enable an enumeration attack by an app provider. And the enumeration attack is there's a way for me to basically copy a database that gives me business knowledge. Set of users of this service, how many users are in the service, the churn rates for the service, all of those which are today proprietary data, I don't think can be made public. So that I think is a requirement.
But they are public already today. That's my point.
Where do you go to download the list of every WhatsApp user and get an update every day? You cannot do that today.
You just do a lookup for their keys. I mean, you would be throttled by rate limiting for sure.
Yeah, you would be throttled by rate limiting.
There are
That's
ways
how you
around
prevent
that.
the enumeration attack. That's all. We're agreeing on that. The only thing you should be able to do is do a lookup at a pace that's appropriate for your use case. There is no way for me to get a copy of the database. That's all I'm saying. I believe is
yeah, and the other thing I wanted to add is, I agree on the privacy requirements of the mapping database are not important, but as I said, and I put that as a explicit non-requirement in my deck. But there's another privacy requirement which is very important, which is the privacy of the lookup query itself, because that leaks your communication graph.
I agree. In fact, largely based on your presentation on IETF and documents, I thought that was a pretty good idea. So at least in my requirements document, I enumerate this requirement. It's later in my slides, but ECR is going to cover this area. So that's a good lead-in to ECR next on the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Giles, can you make sure you mute? Just okay, if you haven't already, just because otherwise we get a lot of echo. Thank you. Next slide. So, like, I think this is already obviously this slide just like recaps something Jonathan's already said, which is you have one or more SSIs. Alice is one of our SSIs. She signs up for some set of applications A, right? And each application has its own SSI. And Bob has Alice's SSI, and she wants to contact Alice. And now he needs some mechanism to look up, the SII, the mapping table, and maybe associate key material. But maybe that happens in some other mechanism. Maybe like you find out it's they're on WhatsApp and you ask WhatsApp for the key material. So we need some kind of mechanism, service, whatever for that. So I think everyone sort of agrees on that. However, it actually works out. One thing that's sort of like I want to just lampshade and then not talk about is we haven't decided whether Bob gets like the entire set of mappings. There's one mapping. Or maybe he gets to say, like, give me one mapping that is out of my list or whatever. We can deal with that later. But I notice we haven't come down on that, and it might be a relevant question. Okay, next slide. So I added this at the very last minute, but this is what I was chatting about earlier. Here's like an intuition pump, which is not intended to be like a national system, but like to be on the contrary, like look at this and look at this and keep it in mind as you decide what you think is wrong with this, so you know what you should be trying to fix. So here's like the most naive possible system. You have a certificate authority and some kind of called public directory. Actually, you could even have the public directory generally, but I think we all agree that's bad. So this is the web PKI, right? Alice gets a certificate by proving that she can receive messages at this phone number. The certificate gets issued, upload the certificate to the public directory, and then Bob, when he wants to talk to Alice, downloads the entire database, or downloads a segment by by phone number or area code or whatever, right? And so privacy is provided in the usual anonymity sense by like saying what big a fragment of the database does Bob download. Now, obviously, you could staple PIR on the arrow 5 here if you wanted. So again, I'm not here pitching this proposal. What I'm saying is like bear this in mind, because a lot of things that we're going to be talking about over the next 8 slides or 7 slides are deficiencies with this picture. And so when you look at this, be like, this sucks. Try to think about why this sucks, and then we can talk about what we might try to fix. Next slide. Okay, so as I sort of opened with earlier, I think actually the most important problem is not any of these privacy concerns we're talking about, but rather the security of this SI and SSI mapping. And that is to say, by the way, I'm not watching the queue, so someone will shout at me when I should shut up. I am now actually. Like, you know, I have a phone number, and is it the case that any provider can merely assert that I am using that provider with my phone number? That's clearly not okay if there's a multiplicity of providers that are like more than a very small number. So who's allowed to assert it? And so I think there are these 3 possibilities. You know, one is, you know, that if there's a discovery service, the kind Jonathan's been contemplating, that's the one person who gets to assert it, in which case they have to verify it in some way. There's an or maybe the application provider gets to assert it, in which case, as I say, what stops the application provider from asserting an SII that doesn't actually own, or maybe only a user can assert it, you know, hoisted again by maybe some kind of like, you know, with PKI apparatus, as in the diagram I showed a minute ago, or by direct validation, as in SPIN. So I think, you know, obviously all of these things implicitly assumes the phone network, if it is phone numbers, accurately routes things, but that's just an assumption I think we have to make, because the only way that from validating these SIs is forward routing. I guess so. I think I'm going to stop at each of these slides. So I think, like, what are people's expectations about who gets to make these assertions and how? Jonathan, I'm pretty sure earlier.
Yeah, it's just a minor terminology nit with regards. I go along with trust. Another word I hate is security, because you know it usually encompasses multiple different attributes of what you're trying to protect. And I think I just wanted to put the fine point here, like you're focused on integrity here,
Yes,
and verify that the mapping is, you know, the SSI is only associated to an SSI if in fact that mapping exists. There is a user who has both of those identifiers. Does that seem like an characterization of the property? Okay.
Oddly, I tried to join the queue, and it's not like giving me the option.
You're in the queue.
You're in the queue.
Really? It doesn't show.
Hmm.
All right. So I think the answer is that it's this split trust model. That's what I think we have, where there is a small set of application providers that we do trust to provide the mapping only because we have no choice. Because we have no choice because of the bootstrapping problem. And you pick 1 or 2, and I don't know who's going to pick, but there's a small handful that are trusted to provide the mapping. And for everyone else, the discovery service itself is responsible for generating the mapping, because we put the discovery service in a sort of a more trusted camp. That's what I think the answer is. And you definitely don't trust the end user. I don't see any useful way to do that.
And in this version, the discovery service will independently verify that you possess that SI.
Yes. Yeah.
So like for instance, we said do an SMS and require you to respond to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So for example, and this is what was in my proposed solution, was the discovery service basically runs the mobile number verification process that everyone is used to. It's embedded within apps you use. So for example, let's say I start a new messaging company, you know, Jonathan's messaging or us. I want to be part of the federation. I connect to it. My UI still asks the user to enter their number. My mobile provider sends it to the discovery service. Discovery service does a validation, creates the mapping. The consumer doesn't really know that it was done not by their mobile app provider, but outsourced. In the same way people use Twilio for the most part to do it. I'm suggesting a similar model where now it's done by the discovery service. Something like that.
I'm sorry. Let me just push on this a little bit. Like, are you suggesting that the discovery service would persuade itself that a given user was associated with like who would that authentication be owned by? That is the user or the AP? Namely, could the AP simply claim could the AP like do anything it wanted once? You know, like imagine the other associated data associated with the mapping, not just the SSI, right? A key, for instance. Would the AP be able to staple on its own key?
Yes. So in my model, like there's there's a core thing, which is the discovery service just associates some identifier provided by the AP with that mobile phone number and agrees that that's true, and that verified fact is passed back to the AP, and then the AP can, store whatever additional data it wants associated with it.
Okay,
That's what you're
so that's different from like my diagram above, where it's like there's a credential is owned by the end user, and then user is the only one who can assert facts about themselves, and they might assert that they make assertions about the AP.
Say that one more time, Ecker. Sorry.
Sorry, that's different from the sort of straw man I showed at the beginning, where the user demonstrates ownership, perhaps through the AP's app, but they're the only ones who can make assertions about themselves. So, like the AP would not be able to staple on a new key in that case.
Right. The AP is not able to make the assertion, except for I'm saying I believe we'll have to make exceptions for like a small number of.
No, sorry. I think we're still talking about each other. I don't want to take up too much time on this piece, but like. So what I'm saying is that one of two things can happen. One is that so in the current system, we agree that like the giant provider A will be able to write any crap it wants to write in the database it wants, right?
Yes.
And that when I want to associate my SII with smaller provider B, which is not permitted to do that, then one of two things can happen. One of which is provider B persuades the discovery service that it controls that this user controls that SII. And then from then on, provider B can write any crap it wants for that phone number in the database. And the other possibility is that provider B facilitates an authentication transaction between the user and the discovery service, and then the user gets to write stuff in the database. Provider B can't on its own.
I guess I don't think it's quite either of those two things, but it's closest to the second one.
Okay. Okay. Giles?
I think it's unlikely that we'll have a separate discovery service that's separate from the messaging providers, and in that case, every messaging provider will be basically responsible for their own phone number verification or other form of identity verification. And there might be minimum standards of identity verification that they decide to apply among that federation, much like a certification authority. Like they are basically certification authorities, and so even if you have a separate discovery service, that discovery service would still have to kind of meet a set of requirements that you would apply to a certification authority in order to play in the system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I so yeah. So you're saying basically like these are all self-asserted, and then we have standards that stop them from lying.
Yes. Yes.
Hello?
I don't know if Mimi needs to solve this problem. Like, I think it's a very complicated problem. And like users can already today potentially like access the app. Like if somebody on WhatsApp like has the phone number, they can already kind of go to WhatsApp and be able to kind of look up that phone number. And like there's nothing guaranteeing that we will have that security of SSI to SSI mapping from the actual native app. So trying for like Mimi to kind of solve that problem where like people can kind of circumvent that feels a little weird. Like you need to kind of have almost a higher level like either an operating system or like something in the like that is controlled by the actual SSI provider that will solve that problem for everybody. But I don't think we as Mimi need to solve this specific problem.
Okay, Richard?
Giles used the word certificate authority, so I had to pop up like Beetlejuice. But I actually do think that's the right kind of metaphor here, that pretty much regardless of the solution, you're going to have some trusted authorities. If you don't have some trusted authority, it's all peer-to-peer verification. It's never going to scale. I think the interesting question here is, who those authorities are. I think that Giles is probably right that it's going to be challenging to have any third-party authority here, though I wouldn't completely rule out in principle having something like Let's Encrypt stand in, where there's some authority that bridges this. Maybe that Let's Encrypt thing would stand in for a bunch of second-tier providers who didn't have enough to bandwidth to run their own verification service or establish their trustworthiness as verification services. But at the same time, I think it's also plausible that even in a regime where you had CAB forum standards for what validation should be done before asserting one of these mappings, you could apply those sort of standards to the providers themselves. And so it may be that yes, there's this, you think of this thing as an authority of some sort, but Google with Messages and Apple with iMessage and WhatsApp are they are willing to prove to each other and to the world that they're acting up to the standards that everyone's agreed on, and so they are trusted as authorities, in particular for their users. And in fact, you see this happening in the Web PKI, where Google Trust Services is now a Web PKI authority, and they offer certificates for folks who are hosted on GCP. So it's not totally unprecedented to have that sort of model. I just wanted to respond to what Basil said about not solving this problem. I think this is kind of the problem that we have to solve for MIMI, because it is this integrity problem is the impersonation and redirection problem. And so if we don't have some sort of solution here, then Honest Document's House of Messages is going to be able to pretend to be Ecker and get people to spuriously connect to Honest Document, and when they think they're connecting to Ecker, which I think is not going to be an acceptable security outcome for the system.
I think we're making progress in that we're starting to get to sort of the root of some of the disagreements, right? And I think one of them is this one that Charles just said, which is that the app providers can be trusted, and in which case, and we create that trust by audit or rules or whatever. And I'm not so sure, right? And my view is a little different, which is, well, maybe we could trust a few of them, but the cardinality is high enough. And that's sort of why I went through this other use cases. When you throw in enterprises and B2B SaaS vendors and small consumer players, there's an exponentially increasing risk that, your audit aside, one of these guys is going to either maliciously or accidentally create invalid mappings. I think that my view is that probability quickly rises to 100%. And therefore we need a solution where we have a different entity to which we can apply a much higher standard. Because you could say the same thing, hey, what prevents the discovery provider from being really bad and misbehaving? And I would say, well, it's going to be audits and rules and governance. And Jill says, well, that's exactly what I'm saying, except do it on the app providers. I just don't think you can do it on the app providers, because they're enterprises, they're B2B SaaS vendors, there are small consumer and home shops that need to be allowed to be part of this federation. But there's no way they can either execute the rules that would be required for them, or more importantly, we don't trust them to. And therefore we need a smaller set that we can impose really stringent requirements on. Hey, where's the guy with the Uzi, protecting the computer with the mapping database? That's a requirement, machine gun protected vaults of data. So, you can't do that for everyone who's an AP. So that's why I feel there's a need for discovery service as a separate entity. Thank you.
I mean, I'll jump in. I think this is problem would exist completely outside. The reason I don't think MIMI should solve is because the problem exists outside of MIMI, right? If I go to Google Messages and WhatsApp or whatever, and I look up an SSI, sorry, they are claiming to have that mapping, and so whatever we do, we're not going to be able to solve that specific problem, because it's not an interop messaging happening. It's happening within the app, and so I do think that's something that we need to potentially solve. I just don't think that this place is that this is the right place to solve that problem.
I guess I think that what makes the interrupt problem is that it's between providers, right? Like in the current environment, like when I use iMessage, I'm trusting that Apple has verified that verified that binding. But then if I allow Google, who I don't trust necessarily, to claim that they have that binding, then what happens then? So I think the problem is it's exactly the interoperability that creates the need to solve this problem.
But the problem can kind of exist also within people who are looking at within Apple, like somebody who's looking at some user within Apple, like how do I trust that Apple is actually doing the right thing there? Right? Like just because one person has potentially a trust in Apple doesn't necessarily mean that everybody can be able to trust in Apple.
No, but I'm saying the people who bought Apple devices trust Apple.
Not necessarily.
Well, I understand, but that's an inherent design of that's an inherent design of a closed system like that, right? Is that those systems are all closed systems designed to operate this way, but we're talking about an open system now. Do I wish Apple had a public PKI? I do, but
we need to solve that problem independently of. That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying we need to solve that problem independently of MIMI, right? And look at it kind of holistically across the industry to kind of provide a much better security guarantee for stuff within the network and outside the network.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm not sure we're making progress at this point. Do you re-open the queues? I guess it's Rowan.
I thought we could maybe close it
Yeah.
up.
Okay, so I just wanted to comment on what Richard said about this. We need this. MIMI has to do this, and it's a super high priority. And when he said this, I think he was conflating two things. I think he was conflating that if I decide to go and peer with a hub provider, and I set up, a set of rules about what policies our group chats can have, that I need to have some agreement about how we do identity. And I agree that we absolutely need to have that. I don't agree that we need to have a way to discover that identity broadly on the public internet, and that I need to be able to do that with an arbitrary provider. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, fair clarification, Rowan. And I was to be clear, my intent was to focus more on the integrity and verification half of that, so that ultimately at the end of the day, what I care about as someone who's sending a message is that I know who the counterparty is that I'm sending to. And I think that's the thing that we really need to solve and have some way of building integrity. The reason I queued was some stuff that Jonathan was saying. I just wanted to confirm that it sounds like we were kind of converging on this idea of some sort of authority. The thing that continues to bother me a little bit is Jonathan's use of the word discovery provider. I think that conflates multiple roles in terms of being an authority for certain things as well as a source of information. And I think that going back to the CA analogy, CA doesn't publish a directory of certificates or who has which websites. CA is not the DNS. They just say that whoever holds this public key holds this name. They don't publish that information, CT aside. CT also probably important for the system in the long run, or KT or something like that. But in any case, I think the critical thing here is that we have some sort of authorities, whether that's the providers themselves or there's some external authority. I just want to make sure that we're clear that the important aspect is the authority, not the distribution of the information centralized. And this authority thing will be inherently sort of centralized because you have to do all the vetting and trust establishment. And so I just want to make sure that we're clear that the thing that needs to have that centralization aspect is the authority and not necessarily the information distribution.
Okay, I think we should probably not open up another topic here. But thank you, Ecker. We will have more time for you another time. And we'll move on to Giles.
How's the echo? Is it got better? I think I fixed it.
Yeah, it sounds okay.
All right. You want to go to the next slide? All right. So I try to focus on what's the user journey we're trying to support here, and fundamentally, it's not to respond a bit to what Rohan was saying. It's not that you want to be able to look up a contact in a directory. It's I want to send a message to somebody on another service. In order to do that, I need their public key. There's no way around that. I need their public key, and I also need to know where to send the message. So that's fundamentally the user journey we want requirement that we want to support, and that's the most important requirement here is I have the phone number or the identity handle of another user, and I want to send them a message, and I can't do that unless I have their public key. And then second requirement is if I'm receiving a message, I might have the same, I might use the same phone number or the same identity handle in multiple different clients, or for multiple different services. And I might have one of those services that I use by default and most frequently, and that's where I do my, that's where I operate during the workday, or that's where I want to get my personal messages. And so in the case where I as a message receiver, I have multiple possible clients, I want to be able to specify which client I want to receive a message on. So that's another requirement I've added. Obviously, we need some requirements around the namespace of the identifiers that are used for this lookup. They need to be globally unique. Otherwise, you're going to have collisions. And then I put as a fourth requirement, and that sort of ties into some of the discussion we've just been having, is there should be a way to verify the association between the public key and the user ID. And actually what I was thinking in terms of implementation here, when I put that requirement in, was some kind of I was thinking about some kind of standardization around out-of-band key verification. So like the kind of flow where you have a QR code in WhatsApp where you can verify somebody's identity out of band. But certificate CT like architecture is another possibility there. And I put that as a P1 because I'm not sure whether it should be included or not in the scope of this working group. All right. Next slide. On the privacy requirements, as I already mentioned, the privacy of the social graph is super important. It's one of the most sensitive and persistent pieces of personal information that you can leak, is your social graph, and so the queries to the discovery service should be private. And then so that's like whose public key are you looking for? Who are you looking to communicate with? And the second one is the discovery service itself that should not learn the querying user identity if possible, because that's the other side of the social graph, right? It's who are you looking for and who are you when you're looking for that person. And then the third one is just about, as well as the social graph, it should also not learn the timing or the exact timing at which you're sending a message. So those are the privacy requirements. If you go to the next slide, I also added some privacy non-requirements, which we've been discussing.
Sorry, I just wasn't sure if you want to take any questions.
Yeah.
Go to the non.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Just a quick clarifying question. Especially on this first point. When I naively come to this and think revealing social graph, that says to me revealing kind of both endpoints of an arc in the graph. So both the querying user ID and the receiving user ID. And in a lot of cases, people don't regard those independently as sensitive. But I mean, are you trying to say that like just revealing that somebody is querying for Giles is something we need to protect against?
That's kind of number two. I think number one is strictly about the recipient, the message recipient.
So let me explain this a little bit differently. So like imagine Richard is on WhatsApp, which is querying iMessage, and Giles is on iMessage. I'm trying to figure out how to reach him. Like I'm querying for your number at Apple. Are we, I guess there's a couple of things we could worry about folks learning in that system. And they could learn that Richard is asking for Giles, which is the most sensitive thing, obviously. They could learn that Richard is asking for someone.
Yeah.
And they could learn that someone is asking for Giles, or maybe someone at provider in both of those someone cases.
Yeah,
are you just like
I get your question.
Just asking which are we trying to cover here?
So number one is somebody is asking for Giles. Number two is Richard is asking for somebody. And the reason I separated those out is because number one is easier to protect as part of the protocol. Number two, like it's basically IP privacy, and it's going to be more of a standard, certifying the service provider than a protocol thing, right? You for number two, you'd have to prove that the service, the discovery service doesn't log your IP address.
So I think it's useful to kind of be precise in this stuff as we go, and I'll shut up in a second here. But because I think the fact that we have this client to server to server or client to server model built in here, like provides opportunities for anonymity, at least in anonymizing to the level of
right. And that's why I've said in the requirement, I'm assuming a client to server. I'm saying the resolver service, in other words, the identity, the discovery service, shouldn't share the client identity with the next hop, right?
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Eric?
Yeah, I just want to make sure to sharpen a point that I think you're making implicitly, which is it is not a goal here to conceal from the application provider which numbers I'm looking up. So if I'm on WhatsApp and I want to know the phone number of somebody and maybe they're on iMessage, like WhatsApp and iMessage both get a lot of information, or at least WhatsApp does.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And I agree. I've missed that out of the non-requirements. Good point.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Jonathan?
Yeah, so if you could go back to the first slide. One of the areas where I noted, I think we were saying different things, is this first bullet and whether or not the scope of this is also to, in fact, retrieve the public keying material. Because I did not think it was.
No, it's not. It's not.
It's not.
No.
Right
No,
here.
and it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that in number 1. It says discover the service IDs where you can retrieve the public key material.
I see. So in your model, the discovery service is not like literally sending me the certificate. It's just
No.
it's sending me the place I can go to get the certificate, which is may or may not be the same place. Is that always the same place I go to send messages, or you're not opining on that question?
Not opining on that. Yeah.
Okay. One other question for clarification. You were going back and forth with Richard. I didn't think I heard the actual answer to Richard's question, which is we have these 2 cases that we want to worry about. Are we worried that the information that someone is querying for Jill's is revealed, or are we worried about Richard is querying for someone is revealed, or both? I think you're saying both, but I want you to say
We're worried about both, but the solution to those problems
are different. Yeah, I understand, but it's a requirements question, because I think that's important. You're explicitly trying to, like, if I want to message you, you want to make sure that the discovery provider can't figure out that I'm actually trying to find you. That's what you're trying to, you think we should protect against that.
Yes. That's why I say, I guess the top level is the protecting the social graph, and there are 2 components, like Richard said.
Right.
But honestly, I don't think the protecting the querier's identity is not really a solvable problem. So I would focus more on the protecting the identity of the query.
Right, the target of the query. Yeah. Okay, got it. Because I think it's interesting, and I'll just poke at that one last bit. We also just said, and Ecker asked this question, that you're not worried about protecting that from the app providers. In other words, so if I'm on WhatsApp and you're on iMessage, like, well, obviously, like, iMessage and WhatsApp are going to know that we're communicating. You also, however, said, I thought in our previous discussion, that you thought the app providers and the discovery providers were the same. Okay, so then why do we have this requirement?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because when I make a discovery query, I'm going to be looking up the potential recipient on services where I don't have an account, right? Or where I don't have an identity. And so those would also learn my identity, even though I'm never going to communicate with you on.
I see. So I think you're making an important assumption in design, right? You're making an assumption that there's like a forking query where every app provider has this directory, and when I want to look someone up, I basically query, my provider queries all of those providers, and I don't want the ones who don't own the number to know. That's, I think, again, there's even if you agree with the requirement that there's multiple app providers, I don't think it implies that you fork the queries. But now I at least understand where you're coming from with this requirement.
I'm not sure how you could.
So this is part of what's in my draft. My draft has a bunch of different pieces which can be used independently of each other. One of them is this idea of using Bloom filters for routing protocols, and because Bloom filters have really nice privacy protecting properties. So you can imagine there's a model where I'm distributing Bloom filters with enough size that I don't need to query everyone. I only need to go query the few that are still, put together in the Bloom filter, and that's a subset. Now there's still a forking query, and a malicious provider could ignore that, but there are solutions like that that don't necessarily require query. And another solution is well, you don't want to fully distribute the database, I guess, because of, well, you could. If you only cared about the social graph and you thought the database was public, I could just distribute the whole database. Then there's no queries ever.
But still, somebody learns the query.
In the model where you distribute the database, there is no query.
Oh, you mean to the clients?
No, to the app providers. Like, let's say basically all the providers exchange all their databases nightly. I'm making this up. right? So basically every app provider has this whole database of all the numbers, all the email addresses, and what providers they're on. In that case, there's no need for a query. We're building a replication protocol. The only thing that's ever seen is the message transmission, which we just acknowledged is not privacy. We're not worried about its privacy. That is a solution.
I'm not sure I follow that, but
okay. I'm probably taking up anyway. Thank you.
I think we might be straying from the requirements a little bit here to solutions. So, I mean, maybe we can refine that requirement to provide nobody but the sender and recipient service providers should learn the social graph, right? I think that's the real requirement here. Elisa?
Yeah, this is roughly what I got in the queue to say. I feel like there's like a matrix of privacy requirements to be written down here related to specifically which entities the requirements are being placed on. Like the piece that's missing in this whole conversation is like being disclosed to whom, right? It's not just like disclosure. And so like you have the sender, you have the sender's provider, you have the receiver and the receiver's provider. And those are entities that we know of because they exist in MIMI. And then there might be additional entities we need to talk about if we think there's going to be independent discovery services or whatever. But at the very least, like the sender's provider and the receiver's provider, we need to establish what they should be allowed to know at query time. And I think what you're saying is, or maybe a little bit of what got lost there, is that by virtue of, by the time you send the message, they both know who's sending and receiving, but by virtue of querying, they should not necessarily learn that the complete graph until it's established that the recipient actually wants to be reached on the recipient's service provider. And then Richard also put in the chat something I was going to echo, which is that I don't think we should necessarily assume that you can't hide the sender's all of the sender's identifiers, including the IP address, because like we have technology that could do that. So a service provider that wants to hide or wants to allow that to be hidden at query time could support that. So I think if we're at requirement stage, we should leave that open as a possibility.
Great. Yeah, you said it really well with the matrix of requirements. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to get to. Thanks. Rohan?
Jonathan asked a question about, do you assume fork? And I just wanted to, again, point out that the user's application could go and do this themselves, right? The user could be like, oh, they want to reach this phone number. I'm going to try and see if there is a user associated with this on these 3 services. Or they could even prompt the user and say, hey, I found this phone number on the following 2 services, do you care which one I should try? So I just want to keep that in mind, that there's a lot of user, we can push this problem to the user for quite a while, and that it might actually be really useful at the beginning. And then you can get better interoperability by doing that.
But sorry, there's a lot of noise on somebody's line. Even if in that case where you have the direct communication between like a fan out from client to services, a bunch of services that you're never going to send a message to would then learn who you're trying to communicate with in that design. Maybe I'll just finish off the deck here. So can you go to the non-requirement side? So so number 1 means is what I've been talked a lot about already, is that it shouldn't be a goal to, like, the directory is public already. There is rate limiting, but that can also be built into any implementation of this design. So that should be an explicit non-goal. Also hiding the existence of a particular phone number or a particular public key, even independently of the mapping, is also not a goal. And the association between the public key and a user ID is also public. It's in the name. And also, we're not trying, as I mentioned, we're not trying to look up contacts by name. There's another slide with some more requirements that haven't been discussed yet. So can we, unless there's, Eric and Jonathan, do you want to comment on that? Any of that?
I'd like to push on this this point 1 here, because I thought you were asserting a stronger version of this, which is this information is not secret. It seems to me there are 2 versions one could assert. One is this information is not secret, and we're not going to make any attempt whatsoever to conceal it, and it'll be just fine if we publish it on the internet. And the other is this information is not like super secret, but people are going to try to like rate limit it or whatever, because like it actually does limit. So I would say 2 things about this. One, assuming there is rate limiting, actually does, assuming that like there is any attempt to conceal it and there will be rate limiting, actually does limit the design space quite a bit. For the reasons Jonathan and I were discussing at the very beginning of this presentation, which is to say that if you have a system which is like functionally open and which allows new participants to come online as APs, and those APs are allowed to query for any substantial subset of the database, even with rate limiting, then it's easy to spin up a large number of fake APs and simply require the entire database. And so like, so I think like either we have to decide that it is actually a requirement to prevent scraping, or it is not. And if it is a requirement to prevent scraping, then we need one set of designs. If it's not a requirement to prevent scraping, we need another set of designs. But I think we have to come down on one or the other.
I would say the requirement to prevent scraping is outside the scope of this working group. So.
Okay, but I guess it's one thing to say this is people's problem. What I'm saying is that an architecture in which there's an open query system that's only rate limited by the attempting to throttle the APs is like really does not, like there's no rate limiting that will possibly work. And so like it's an incompatible because of the database. And so which I'm fine with, I guess, but like
it'll work just as well as it works today with each individual provider's key distribution services. Like the only thing that protects them from being an open directory is rate limiting. So we're not changing anything.
I don't necessarily agree with that, but I guess I'm just saying. But what I'm saying, I guess part of what I'm saying here is that like there are designs which don't even attempt to provide any concealment, right? As I said, one in which you just flood fill the entire database, right? And like they may or may not have merits, but like if we're not going to try to protect this, then those designs are in scope. But if we are, then they're not in scope, and I think that has trickled down effects in the rest of the design.
Yeah, I guess there's maybe feeds a little bit into the next slide, is that we don't want to set up the economic incentives of the system in such a way that it would be hard for any individual player to do rate limiting. So I do think that we should consider that rate limitability requirement, but I don't think. I think we should only consider it from the kind of economic incentives point of view and not from the technical implementability point of view, if that makes sense.
So yeah, but I want to come back. I was going to make a similar point. I still think we're not quite there yet, right? Okay, and I'm going to try and ask the same question Ecker was asking in a different way. There's 2 classes of solutions for this problem. One class of solution is where there's a lookup operation that's done on an entity that holds the database, and there's another solution where we simply distribute the database everywhere. One of the big differences is on whether or not you're trying to protect against enumerations. Am I worried about that at all? Okay, we all agree rate limits are a policy thing and what have you, but they're not even policy in a system where you're just
Oh, wait,
distributing the data.
wait. There's
Distribute the
a
data.
third solution where you don't have a central database, and you don't farm the database out to everybody, but each service provider is responsible for queries on their own shard, and that's the solution that I'm thinking of.
I understand, but that's fine. But that still rules out I'm saying I believe there was a requirement here, and I'm still not sure. And I'm going to state it again. I believe that there is a requirement that it is not possible for a consumer or an app provider to trivially to get a full copy of this database. We are trying to protect that. It may be hard. We have to do rate limits, blah blah blah. But like that is a goal. A goal of the design is to try and make.
Yeah.
What's that?
I'm fine with that. I think.
Okay.
Having
because
that
I don't think everyone else has been fine with that. Like that's why I want to state that as we have had postulated proposals here in this meeting, which are of the form, I'm just going to publish the database on the internet, and like anyone can download it. Like I'm going to and that was in fact that was Eric's starting proposal, I think, right? Like let's poke holes in it, and this is one of the holes I want to poke to see if we are aligned on this requirement. So I think you are in agreement. If someone doesn't agree, it'd be great for them to join the queue.
I think I do agree, but I'm going to try and situate this in the context of the disagreement. So what I think Ecker was trying to say was that it is largely that if you have an open system where anyone can be an AP, like then the open query interface and public database cases are the same case, because anyone can spin up a number of non-rate limited, a number of rate limited actors to make a bunch of queries and download the database. And whereas I think what Giles is saying is those are actually separate cases. We live in the open query interface today, and rate limits are enough of a protection to prevent that from degenerating the public database case. So I think that seems plausible to me, just based on kind of the empirical evidence. And so, yeah, it seems plausible that we could go for a design here that presumed an open query interface without thinking that degenerated into a public database situation.
But I think it's important that the owner of the database is in control of the rate limiting. Oh, sorry, the owner of the data is in control of the rate limiting. So you don't want a situation where WhatsApp and Google give all their entire directory to a third party who then completely neglects to do rate limiting, right? And they're not able to influence whether they do rate limiting or not.
So we have one more presenter and not that much time. So I think we should take this to the list to continue discussion.
Okay.
Thank you. And we'll move on.
Could I finish this slide? Because I think these requirements are pretty important.
I really think we should take it to the list, just to be respectful of Vittorio's time as well.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so this was my attempt at defining the problem and the requirements, which is the first half of my draft. So I will not get into the second half, which is the possible solution. So next slide, please. So first of all, I am trying to describe the discovery problem at a much higher level of abstraction than what we've been doing here mostly. So I will just define it very abstractly as the need to convert a user identifier, which is service independent and is human friendly, into one or more account identifiers, which are something that includes all the information that you need to actually then establish the connection and start the rest of the process. So in a way, what you are trying to map here is any number of one-to-many non-exclusive unidirectional relations, meaning that the same account identifier can appear or be associated with more than one user identifier. Actually, the same person can have more than one user identifier if they want. And And so at the same time, the relationship is unidirectional, meaning that there's no mapping in the other direction. But what is also different in my way of thinking of this problem is that I'm not assuming that we are just mapping telephone numbers or email addresses. I really think we should start thinking at a new native MIMI identifier, because that would solve many of the issues, and it would provide an alternative, at least for people that don't want. So let's get to the next slide. The next slide is about the use cases. So also, I think we should be clear about the use cases that we want to support. And I worded them not like user B wants to contact user A, but user A wants user B to contact them, because that's, I think, conceptually the way we want to describe this. And so the first two use cases are actually the same, except that it's a different identifier. So the first is the native one, in which the user A wants to be contacted through a new native MIMI specific user identifier. And the other one is when, they want to give them rather the email address and the telephone number. And in the end, they are very similar, but they might be different in the resolution. So you might have actually different resolution systems for the two cases. The third case is when, it could be important for them, let's say the migration. So the user already knows actually their identifier in another service. They know the telephone number, the email address, and when they want at least to try contacting them. And of course, this includes the problem of accepting the introduction. So making sure that in this case, user A actually wants to be contacted. But I think this is out of scope for the discovery. So this is something that needs to happen in the clients when the connection actually happens. So next slide. So I tried to define what are the requirements on the identifiers. We didn't, I saw some of the presentations having something that looked like kind of one of these identifiers, but we should really think at what they need to be. And so my first most important point is that I don't want to be forced to be reachable by an email address or by my mobile phone number, because I don't want all the people that already have my email address or my telephone number, which has been the same for the last 15 years, to be able suddenly to start flooding my MIMI client and trying to get a connection with me. And yes, I know that on WhatsApp, if you want, like everyone, you are on WhatsApp currently, having the telephone number of someone is enough. But the policy point of MIMI is that I can actually close my WhatsApp account and tell them to forget my telephone number. And from that point on, maybe I will not be reachable on MIMI by telephone number. Maybe in the future, people will not even have telephone numbers anymore or email addresses. So we should make sure that the system is independent from the existence of these other previous communication systems. And so, of course, the requirements are on the MIMI identifiers, because the other ones already exist. And the MIMI identifiers should, of course, be simple, be human-friendly, but more importantly, I think that they should not just be owned by the service or app provider. So the users that want, like for email, which is my model, they should be able to own their identifier. So to make sure that even if in the future they want to change their MIMI provider, they don't have to change their identifier. And most people possibly will be lazy or not technical enough and will just get whatever identifier their major or main service provider gives them. But for people that care, I think you should at least give them the flexibility of having something that they actually own as an identifier. And so this also includes some kind of portability made through preserving the identifiers while changing the accounts that it is associated to. And of course, the identifiers should not be easily guessable unless the user wants to. So our email addresses are generally very guessable because they're name, family name, whatever. But if I want to have something that cannot be guessed, it should be possible for me to have something which looks entirely anonymous. So next slide, please. So then there are some requirements on the solution. And my requirements for the solution would be that, first of all, it should be able to scale to any number of users and relationships. And it should be decentralized. So the problem I have with all this, like one provider, a few providers solution, is that there are several problems. But one is that they could be easy points of surveillance to map the social graph of people. So if we can make this very centralized, then I think it's better for privacy. Maybe do we take the questions now? So Eker, if you have a question.
Yeah, so I do think we want it to prevent surveillance, but I think the answer is not to centralize. The answer is cryptography, which is the point that I'm sure Giles. Yeah. Decentralized doesn't remove surveillance. It just spreads surveillance around. The answer is to have a technical solution that makes surveillance impossible by the intermediate nodes. So you want PIR, you want something like that.
I think, yeah, I mean, maybe it might be that by using cryptography we make sure that it's not, but I think we should also try not to make this centralized, because also cryptography, you know, in the long term, maybe what's secure today might not be secure in the future. And so, I mean, yeah, we can discuss whether we want to make these a strict requirement, but I think we should aim to have the system as decentralized as possible.
No, I mean, I actually just don't agree with that. I think that's going to have a huge number of architectural downsides, and so no, I don't think that's right, and I don't think it's right from a privacy and security perspective.
Yeah.
Like, if we don't trust cryptography, the game is over. So like, it's not going to matter how many different nodes there are if the cryptography doesn't work. So so no, I think, you know, maybe there are reasons to make it decentralized that do not involve security and privacy, but I do not think that security and privacy motivate this well.
Okay, well, anyway. Okay, so well, anyway, whatever solution we have should offer security and privacy, so hide the social graph and not allow third parties to intercept the communication. And I think that's a sort of implicit, but it's better if we state it. And also, I think we should really build the system for the self-hosting model. So, or anyway, for any number of providers, discovery providers, if we have discovery providers in the end, or if we only have service or app providers, any number of service or app providers. And of course, we should use open standards. And I think we should consider making something which has low barriers. So it is really possible for people to, even for, let's say, smaller operators or even individuals, to deploy a full MIMI service, including the message part, but also the discovery part for their own identifiers. So next slide. And then, so of course, there's some non-tech stuff like not having intellectual property issues, and especially the regulatory issues. I mean, some of the initial proposals, I thought they could be a regulatory nightmare. So again, maybe this is sort of out of scope, but we should look at what we're doing also in these terms. And yeah, in the end, it must work also in economic terms. So next, I think it's actually done, right? So I mean, my main to close this down. I mean, my main point is that I would really like to explore the possibility of having MIMI-specific identifiers designed from scratch, because then you can design them for discoverability. So as I said, I mean, the solution that's in the draft, I don't want to talk about it now, but it's basically based on DNS. The user identifier has some form of a DNS hostname or a URI with a domain name, and then you just do a query for the domain name, and you get all the information that you need. So then maybe you can discuss whether all the information that you have to put is actually something you want to put into a DNS. You can imagine like having an intermediate step, only putting some of it, and then having a direct query to some other whatever. But I think we should explore at least the possibility of having something which doesn't actually require to have a discovery provider, or just requires whoever is providing your service to also provide the discovery part pretty easily as a complement to the service that they have to provide anyway. On the other hand, for external identifiers, I call them external identifiers because from other services like email and telephone numbers, I do agree that it's hard to do without this kind of Oracle or database or whatever. So all the rest of the discussion, I think, applies nicely to that part of the problem, which is fundamental. But I think we should open this up and also have a discussion on native identifiers. So, Lisa.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the main point. Would love to get people's feedback on here. I think that's different from everything else we've discussed thus far in MIMI. So we only have a few minutes, but if people could join the queue and give your thoughts on the MIMI specific identifier, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I'm not in favor of this. I think it's nice from a technical perspective. I think it's not practical to introduce the world to another new identifier and hope that we can get people to know it, use it, distribute it. I appreciate your main concern, Vittorio, on, hey, I want a way to make sure that even though you know my number, you can't, or email address, you can't reach me. You can solve that without a new identifier. And if I need to communicate a new identifier, I'll just communicate my service-specific one. I just don't see the need or the realistic possibility of deploying another new global unique identifier to all of the internet community that is on messaging, which is billions of people. I just don't think it's going to happen. So that's my opinion. Thank you.
Well, yeah, okay. My point would be that you don't have to I mean, you just have to make this possible for people that want to use it. And maybe there will be some smaller new services that use that as their identifier. I mean, then promote it to users. Possibly the dominant ones will not want to do this, so they will just continue to ask for the telephone number, and that's fine. But I'm worried by the idea of not having an alternative. So I mean, deciding straight away that you are that first telephone numbers and or email addresses will always exist, which is a big assumption to me. And second, that people will have to use one of them. I mean, things that are designed for a completely different service, that now they will become the identifier for this. And by the way, the service-specific identifiers, we have to discuss them, but I don't think it will be so easy to have a simple string that has all the information that you need, like at the endpoint and the port maybe, and the account number and maybe version of the protocol. So I see it's very hard to build service-specific identifiers that are also usable as something that you can give to someone else. I think you need to build a separate human-friendly identifier.
I think, I mean, I largely agree with Jonathan. You know, we have like how many billions of users who are using even64 numbers identifier, like that's not going to change. So like whatever we do has to work with even64 numbers. As far as I can tell, all the designs anybody's actually proposed just assume that the identifier is resolvable, is geographically unique, sorry, is globally unique and resolvable. So I don't think it'd be a problem if someone wanted to roll out some new identifier space that didn't depend on either, you know, DNS or even64, but like, so I don't think we'd build a system that precluded that, but I think any system which doesn't support E164 is dead in the water, as far as I can
tell. I think having a service identifier plus an arbitrary string, could be a phone number, it could be any kind of identifier, will give you a globally unique namespace and is compatible with everything we already have today. So I don't think we need anything new.
Jonathan, did you have something more to add?
Yeah, I was just saying, the one thing I would, say would be hard, might be hard. So some of the architectures have assumed that, these are not just globally unique identifiers, but also routable, that, there's some other means outside the MIMI protocol such that you can confirm this person is not lying about that they own this identifier. And if you had a new identifier, that property obviously doesn't hold because it only exists for MIMI. So that might, I see the benefit of, I don't want to give out my cell phone number, but I still want, whatever MIMI identifier I give out to have, portability between providers. And I'm not sure how easy that is to achieve. At least it breaks some assumptions of at least some of the proposals for the other models.
Okay, thank you, Vittorio. I think we got good feedback on that. So it would be great if we could continue this discussion on the list instead of waiting until whenever we get together again, because the next interim is going to be back to the design team. And like, obviously there's a lot to hash out here. This is like complicated design space. So I think if people have I think we should start some individual threads on particular topics. One on the rate limiting and scraping of the database. That's like a good one. The stuff that you didn't get to, Giles. Feel free to start individual threads on individual topics. If that does not happen organically, I think Tim and I might try to instigate that and get the discussion moving a little bit. I also think, I don't know if it's like a little too early for this, but it would be really nice to have a consolidated list of these requirements, like one list, even if it's some of them still have like an option space of like, maybe it's this or that. But it would be nice to get down to like kind of a single view. So I think that could be possible to start now, or we could do some rounds of further list discussion on individual topics and then try to bang that out. But I do think that's something that would help us soon. So that's kind of my takeaway on the end of this meeting. And then the only other thing I will say is I think we will be soon sending out yet another doodle poll for interims in October, more friendly to Europe time for October. So please look out for that. I think we're going to need a bunch more of these, and maybe try to get onto just a regular cadence so we can stop doodling. So that's coming your way. Tim, do you have anything else?
I do not. Oh, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks a lot. See you next time.